Good evening. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here to this conference on Muslim minorities in modern times. Minorities from the minorities in Western Europe all the way to China and to the United States. This conference has been envisaged as the first in a series of conferences under the auspices of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities, which are to deal with issues in comparative history. Now, some comparative historians believe that comparative history should concentrate on differences between the cases under examination and use the comparison in order to arrive at a sharper perception of each individual case, spelling out the uniqueness of each of them. Other comparative historians, of a more ambitious brand, one could say, believe that comparative history should concentrate on similarities between the cases under examination and use the comparison in order to detect common trends and causal links. At this conference, we shall deal, therefore, with various present-day Muslim minorities in non-Muslim countries from a comparative perspective, and it remains to be seen to what extent our deliberations will highlight the uniqueness of each Muslim minority and to what extent we shall be able to detect similarities and propose generalizations. I wish all of us a stimulating and fruitful conference. And now to the organizer, chief organizer of this conference, Professor Yohanan Friedmann, please.
Thank you. It is now my pleasure and privilege to introduce Professor Michael Karayanni, who is a professor of international law at the Faculty of Law of the Hebrew University. He was the director of the Harry and Michael Zacher Institute for Legislative Research and Comparative Law, and also the Minerva Center for Human Rights at the same institution. He held visiting posts at Stanford, at Yale, and at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. His research interests are in private international law and interreligious law, multiculturalism, and civil procedure. His book, Conflicts in a Conflict, was just published by Oxford University Press. Some of his articles bear directly on the subject of our conference, the Palestinian minority in Israel, and minorities and group rights. His opening lecture today will deal with religious millets and multiculturalism in the 21st century. Professor Karayanni, please.
Thank you, and it's an honor to be here and given this opportunity to share some of my views on multiculturalism and religious minorities in the world as at large as well as in Israel, and we will make the connection, hopefully. We live in a twilight zone. This is certainly true in this part of the world. Our reality is endlessly blurred. We seem to be in a continuance of an effort of making sense of the senseless. Some might say this is human nature here as well as everywhere else. Contributing to this is also what is taking place in the world at large. On the one hand, we are witnessing an unprecedented phase of globalization in which borders between states and people are becoming meaningless. Transnational transactions governed by the domain of self-regulation rather than the law of sovereigns are commonplace. With the help of an area of telecommunications and computer services, one is able to be constantly informed of events taking place in every corner of the globe. Jet travel has become more efficient as well as accessible to a wider portion of society. In increasing numbers, people are able to, and actually do, have jobs in 2 different countries at the same time. As a consequence of being able to travel to different places, being more informed and well connected with others around the world, much of our perception of distance, territoriality, borders, and geographical connections has undergone a genuine markets have opened up, transnational transactions are in abundance, and economic unions have flourished. All of this has also contributed to the perception whereby identity, be it civil, cultural, religious, national, linguistic, is as important to any of us as the identity of the manufacturer of the paper we write our contracts on. Is it at all relevant to figure out this fact in order to decide whether the written contract is binding? Just think of the transaction in which we buy a book from Amazon. Do we know what is the nationality of the corporation we are dealing with? Do we know the identity of the country from which the book is sent? Are we at all conscious of the law that governs our transaction, or more importantly, do we really care about this when we conclude the transaction? This reality defies the challenges of our conventional thinking. It implies, as many have indicated, that there is an imaginable sphere, territory if you want, called cyberspace that is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Can contracts exist in such a sphere when there is no national law that regards the transaction as a contract? Borrowing from a preeminent Israeli scholar in the field of private international law, I ask, can a plane constantly fly without the need of fuel from a certain country? In the past, this was not possible. At present, it seems that it is. On the other hand, nations, religions, cultures, ethnicities, and other groups that make a mix of all or some of these are calling for accommodation. Self-determination, autonomy, affirmative action, representation quotas, subsidies, exemptions from certain duties, recognition of language and symbols of groups by the state are common calls in many countries. These calls are frequently met with resistance by whoever is in control, thereby giving rise to tensions, clashes, civil wars, ethnic cleansing, and an area of other measures that we regard as cruel and troublesome. In my lecture tonight, I will focus on the accommodation of religious communities that, drawing on the Ottoman scheme, I will call millets. Let us take stock of some of the calls that are raised by these religious communities or millets. Some seek to promote more tolerance on part of the state for group practices that are otherwise considered to be a crime or socially unacceptable. Such is the case, for example, with male circumcision, the ritual slaughter of animals, wearing certain items of clothing in public, like the veil or the burqa, carrying a small knife, kirpan, or homeschooling children during the age of mandatory education. In other cases, the claims are about affirmative recognition and support of religious institutions and norms that go beyond exceptional treatment. Thus, a religious minority may request the state to accord jurisdiction to its institutions, such as Sharia or rabbinical courts, in order to adjudicate disputes among their members, to receive government subsidies, or to recognize their autonomy in following discriminatory rules of admission to government-funded schools. In our world, if our world was seemingly borderless and overtaken by some kind of an international regime that belongs to all but to none, it now emerges as a space where borders are vital, where nations and groups are pulling inward rather than outward, willing to sacrifice so much for maintaining their separateness, their uniqueness, and all of what makes them special. Going back to the plane example, these groups aspire to exclusively fuel their planes and guarantee their return home after each flight. The struggle between universalism and particularism is not something new. The 20th century, probably the most tragic century in history, was in many respects a showdown between these two forces. What is rather innovative in political and legal thinking is the effort to find a theory that makes it possible to combine between the two rather than prefer the one over the other. Multiculturalism, so I believe, is such a theory. All in all, it seeks to provide us with a set of standards and rules that makes it possible for us to live our religion, culture, ethnicity, nationality, while keeping something in common, be it some fundamental rights and guarantees or some universal system of norms. So multiculturalism is not merely an observation and presentation of societies that happen to be diverse. Rather, it is an argument for why the divergence among those that are present is legitimate and should be accommodated. Instead of diversity being the cause of animosity and hate, it is seen as a reason for tolerance and acceptance. Indeed, some have also come to realize that diversity could also be in itself a value to cherish. Given the intergroup dialogue and the exchange of ideas it manages to generate, diversity can be a blessing rather than a curse. Yet some forceful arguments were put forward, claiming that accommodating particular groups might resolve one set of problems, but at the same time create another set no less acute. One disturbing reality is that the accommodation granted to one group is seen to be at the expense of other groups, promoting intergroup tensions rather than tolerance. In due course, this tension could lead to demands for secession from the original sovereign unit. Another dilemma is concerned with relative values. What if the group accommodation enables the group to apply norms that go against universal notions of liberal thought? For example, when a religious group is accommodated, making it possible for its institutions to apply norms that overtly discriminate against women. In what follows, I will lay out some of the fundamental principles of multiculturalism as a normative theory, observe some of its problematic features, and then try to assess the desirability of having religious millets in the 21st century. It is widely regarded that liberalism maintains that the state should be neutral when it comes to the ethnic and religious identity of its citizens, an approach commonly termed as blindness to difference. According to this approach, no ethnic or religious group deserves any preferential treatment by state authorities. Critics of minority rights have argued that to ascribe rights or benefit on the basis of membership in a particular group is an arbitrary and inherently discriminatory act that will eventually lead to a ranking of first and second-class citizens. The sole entity that is entitled to rights and protections from this point of view is the individual. And from the point of view of liberalism, all individuals are to be treated equally, especially on the normative level. i.e., when state institutions come to prescribe norms of conduct. Under this conception, individuals, of course, have a right to join in with different societies and associations as they see fit, but have no right to ask the state for preferable treatment for this society or that. The first to challenge such a strict notion of liberalism were the communitarians. This stream of political thought took issue with the liberal paradigm that citizens as rational, autonomous agents are imagined to make choices on the basis of values and commitments they have judged to be valid, independent of any external factor that their society, history, or culture. Communitarians have argued that individual ties to society, history, and culture are contingent aspects of identity and part of one's being. Moreover, it has been argued that people, in an ontological sense, must be understood as constituted by relations with others without which they will cease to be who they are. So according to communitarian view, individuals engage even in thinking and acting not in a detached, reflective mood, but with fully embedded personalities defined and shaped by a social milieu. The above notions of strict liberalisms have been refuted by what came to be called liberal multiculturalism. Societies composed of majority group and minorities cannot be neutral among all their members, even if they adopt the most liberal framework of administration. Government in all of its branches will be more closely connected to the interests of the majority group than to the interests of the minorities. This is an inevitable reality in democratic societies, since the majoritarian mood of government guarantees the majority group the greater share in government. This point has long been acknowledged by research in the social sciences. In what came to be known as May's theorem, it was proven that if all persons are permitted to participate in all decisions under conditions that ensure that one person's identity or preferred outcomes have special status, but that each person has an equal chance to cast the decisive vote, then the decision will inevitably give preference to majority interests. Therefore, one way of protecting minority groups is by empowering them in relation to the majority through a number of multicultural accommodations intended to enforce their group identity and political strength. Without such protection, the minority group will be assimilated, thereby endangering its very nomos. Aside from the dangers of excluding the minority group from the political process. Therefore, it was argued that states should work to grant minority groups preferable treatment, both for the sake of empowering the minority group in its relation with the majority group, and for the sake of enabling the minority group to preserve its distinctive features, which may be national, ethnic, religious, or cultural. Other multiculturalists have advocated the need for group rights from a purely liberal point of view. Individuals need to belong to a group as a matter of self-fulfillment. It has been argued that a person's autonomy of choice and judgments, cornerstones of liberal thought, are intrinsically tied to the community from which they come from. People grow up in households and communities that tend to shape their virtues and qualities as individuals, and therefore have a personal need to continue to belong to their groups as a form of individual realization. Liberalism, as such, demands that groups, particularly minority groups, be accommodated, for in preserving the group identity, individuals in the group can operate to their full capacity. As this theory of group rights crystallized, however, a major problem arose. How should liberal multiculturalism relate to religious minorities or groups that adhere to practices that are regarded to be illiberal? For example, the religious minority is seeking guarantees for its autonomy over its members, while it itself is claiming for the right to discriminate against certain members, such as women, and in some respect, even children. I shall refer to this conundrum as the multicultural entrapment. In this respect, the seminal essay of Susan Muller-Auken, Is Multiculturalism Bad for Women?, was an eye-opener showing how internal group practices, most of which were religious minorities, can be especially problematic for women. She argued that some groups seeking accommodation uphold familial honor killings, female genital mutilation, arranged marriages, polygamy, and other practices that would be clearly prohibitive under most recognizable liberal agendas. Children, too, are vulnerable to illiberal group practices. For example, the United States Supreme Court decision in Wisconsin's versus Yoder concerning Amish parents who asked to be absolved of criminal liability for removing their children from school at the age of 14 instead of the legally mandated age of 16, justified their actions on the basis of their and their community's protected freedom of conscience. Ultimately, the court absolved the parents from criminal liability based on their individual freedom of conscience, given the norms and practices of their group. Important as it may be for a community to sustain its existence by indoctrinating its children, this same interest is, if accommodated, will make these children less capable of becoming active and productive citizens of the general society who possess the ability to understand and appreciate the complexities and advantages of modern life. Indeed, much discussion has ensued regarding the propriety of accommodating minority religious groups, especially if such groups adhere to patriarchal norms and/or other restrictive practices. Some scholars argued that such religious groups should not be accommodated at all. For how could individuals rejecting liberalism as a guiding principle in their internal conduct be accommodated in the name of liberalism? On a more fundamental level, the claim is that the classical liberal right of freedom of association and the politics of affiliation is in itself sufficient to accommodate all groups who would like to come together and promote their joint ideals, interests, and aspirations. Therefore, no active support or accommodation need to be afforded by the state to any of the existing groups, minorities or otherwise. Leaving them alone will be sufficient. Yet, those who take seriously the claim that one's individual capacity to evaluate reality and decide how to act in a normative manner is inherently embedded in one's group identity, cultural, ethnic, religious, or racial, cannot be indifferent to the weakening of this identity, even when the particular group is illiberal in its internal practices. Therefore, something more than a guarantee for the basic freedom of association need to be granted. Proponents of multiculturalism as a normative political legal structure designed to accommodate minority groups are ready to endow special rights to such illiberal groups, along with some kind of guarantee that such an accommodation will not undermine the rights of minority individuals. One scholar has proposed that the accommodation of minority groups take the form of an external protection, i.e. protection of the minority group from the hegemonic majority. Accordingly, it is legitimate for the state to recognize the official status of a minority language, minority holidays, and to ensure that the minority has representatives in government bodies. However, if the accommodation grants the minority the power to apply its internal norms to its members, what we call internal restrictions, these prerogatives should be reserved or restricted. Such is the case when a minority is granted jurisdictional powers over its members in matters of personal status. This approach has been criticized given the fact that it is not always clear if the accommodation is of the internal restriction type or the external protection type, and even if it is the latter, it will indirectly give rise to the imposition of internal restrictions. Other theorists are ready to accommodate illiberal religious groups with an extensive jurisdictional authority over their members as long as such members have the option to exit, and thus relieve themselves from the imposition of illiberal practices. However, the mechanisms of exit is not beyond question. In cases where group membership is ascribed by birth rather than by choice, exit can be very difficult in practice. And this is paradoxical in a sense, right? Because we tend to believe that if I choose entry, then it would be more possible or less possible to exit. But when entry is imposed on me, then I would exit freely. But it's the opposite case. Once we ascribe a certain identity, then exit becomes even harder. Moreover, choice to remove oneself from such an affiliation can be very harsh, requiring a complete break from a community one was raised in and is fond of many aspects of. In my class, I bring the case of a Bedouin woman who would like to leave its community. I mean, we can see polygamy as something which is practiced, and it is practiced in southern Israel today. But I, as a Bedouin woman, still cherish much of what I have as a culture. I can be a Hasidic woman and be imposed or be restricted internally to practice this and that, but I can still cherish much of my Hasidic culture. So to say to a person, why, if you don't like it, you can just leave or exit, and that's the solution of this problem, is not really a solution. It's like a zero-sum game. Some people would call it, it's like holding a gun in the back head of a person, either your culture or your freedom, and this is inhuman in a sense. And think of children. How can children as young as 12 years old be able to decide that they want to leave their group? Thinking of the Amish child. Can he freely decide to leave his group if he would like to? More nuanced propositions argue that the best way to handle intra-group illiberal practices is by promoting reforms from within that can be realized by such mechanisms as deliberative democracy. According to this approach, mechanisms can be instituted within illiberal groups that would facilitate deliberation of internal group norms, which would then be agreed upon by group institutions before they become enforceable. Such internal deliberation will eventually cause internal norms and practices to become more accommodating to vulnerable group members. The second major problem of multiculturalism is the state of intergroup tensions that the politics of recognitions can give rise to. If a state is willing to grant minority groups the ability to organize separately and to grant territorial autonomy, this may lead to growing demands on behalf of that group for secession and independence. Underlying this forecast is the assumptions that groups like individuals work to maximize their interests, which entail the desire on the part of minority groups of becoming a majority in a territory of their own. But even if this does not happen, whether because the type of group rights granted is not in the form of territorial autonomy, or because the group is tied by other means to the majority, still, granting groups the ability to advance their group identity could lead, at the very least, to tensions among the different groups. To ease this intergroup tension, a series of techniques have been proposed. One such technique advocates intergroup dialogue. Ways and moods of tolerance and respect among the different groups should be advanced with the encouragement and backing of state authorities in order that groups, through their members, come to realize that sharing cultures can also be a self-fulfilling experience. With all this in mind, I come now to discuss and analyze the justifications and ramifications of accommodating religious communities from the point of view of multiculturalism as a normative theory. This inquiry is called for in light of the fact I alluded to earlier that the multicultural circumstance of religious minorities claiming for exemptions and special rights is very much present in many places around the world. Another important reference I would like to make here is to the Ottoman millet system. This system that existed in other earlier empires reached a certain zenith during the period of the Ottoman Empire as the religious communities came to be defined by a sophisticated system of personal laws, religious courts, and exemptions, if we are to add the various capitulation agreements with foreign powers. That is a prototype for the claims raised today by many religious communities in the West. Moreover, certain features of this Ottoman millet system are still present in many Middle Eastern and Asian legal systems today, including that of Israel. Given the venue of this conference, allow me to give you an overview of the Israeli millets. All in all, Israel has 14 different religious communities that are officially recognized as such. The Jews that come to about 75% of the Israeli population, which is about 8 million, the Jewish community coming to about 6 million. And Arabs compose about 20% of the Israeli population, all in all about 1.6 million. And this Arab community is itself divided among 12 different religious communities, the Muslims, who are the majority and form about 17% of the total population in Israel, the Druze and the Christians, each about 2%, more or less, of the total Israeli population. And the Christian community in Israel is itself divided among 10 different recognized religious communities. And adding to that is the Baha'is, who were also recognized in 1971. So you have 14 different recognized religious communities. These divisions have legal implications. Under the long-standing Ottoman millet system, these religious communities are empowered by legislation to establish their own religious courts and apply their own religious norms to their members in many personal status matters. The religious courts of the recognized religious communities are accorded exclusive jurisdiction over the matters of marriage and divorce of their local members. In other matters of personal status, like those pertaining to alimony, child custody, and inheritance, the religious courts have a concurrent judicial capacity to deal with such issues and even apply their religious norms if some preconditions exist. The most common is consent of the parties. Without such consent, the parties must resort to the regular civil courts, today the family court, which on certain issues like alimony will still apply the relevant religious law of the parties instead of the usual civil territorial norm. So in essence, the religious identity of Israelis serves in a number of spheres to connect the individual to a particular legal system. It can determine the governing law, which we call the lex causa, for a certain relationship exactly as the law of the place where the tort was committed or that where the contract was concluded can determine the governing law in each of these disciplines. Reality is a matter of perception. This is certainly true when we come to evaluate the normativity of legal schemes and institutions such as the millet system in Israel or similar institutions in other countries. In this last part of my lecture, I would like to make 3 claims in respect of the accommodation of religious groups when these accommodations are evaluated from the point of view of multiculturalism. First, the accommodations of religious minorities cannot be treated at par with the jurisdiction and concessions granted to majority group. The majority group does not need a concession or an accommodation in order to maintain its identity or for the interests of an inclusive democracy. The very fact that the majority is in control of many facets of society, of government, of the parliament, of the judiciary, makes it strong enough in order to fashion its identity as its main voices dictate. Should that identity change or fade away, then be it. This is a natural evolution. Things are different in terms of minorities. All other things being equal, minority cultures are not governed by the will of the minority, but are under the influence of majority hegemony and the majoritarian rule of democracy. This weakness makes it necessary to empower religious minorities. In the realm of multiculturalism, there is discussion as to whether there need to be a further distinction within the category of minorities, a distinction between immigrant minorities and indigenous minorities. From the point of view of multiculturalism, the case of indigenous minorities is much stronger. They did not choose to relocate, and in so doing imply that they want to leave behind their group identity. Rather, the state was imposed on them and in due course brought to their weakening and marginalization. They became strangers in their own homeland. The case is different on part of immigrant minorities. By leaving their homeland, they indicated in a sense that they are implicitly consenting to leave behind their original identity and are in a position of wanting to take a new one instead. Thus, their quest of preserving what they have chosen to leave behind is a less powerful argument. But in reality, the case of immigrant minorities is different. It's not always this case. Some of them did not willingly leave, but were forced to. In other cases, they were invited in as a working force in the host state, who after building itself wanted to enjoy the profits and disregard the obligations. Moreover, if it is the individual well-being that is at the heart of multicultural thought, and immigrants have become citizens, should it not be the case that their well-being is also a matter of interest to their new country? The second claim I would like to make is that multiculturalism theory makes it necessary to distinguish between religious minorities and other minorities such as linguistic or national minorities. This is not because that religious and national minorities are less meaningful or marginalized than religious minorities tend to be, but more because the type of accommodations that suit these minorities. Recognizing the language, narrative, and symbols of linguistic and national groups, together with some representation quotas, might very well satisfy their demands and interests. Consequently, what these groups are really asking for are, in essence, accommodations of external protections rather than accommodation of internal restrictions. However, when it comes to religious groups, the very nature of the group is about internal restrictions. These seem to be an integral part of all religions, and therefore their accommodation will entail the recognition of their power to internally restrict their members. So the problem I depicted before about the minority within the minority, or what I called the multicultural entrapment is especially present in respect of religious groups rather than linguistic or national groups. This, in turn, makes it necessary to be more sensitive about the internal restrictions of religious groups and to guarantee avenues and mechanisms that will tend to the entrapment. The third claim I come out with concerns less the group. It centers on the constitutional environment in which the religious group exists. Most of the discussion on the propriety of accommodating religious minorities has taken place in the confines of a Western liberal democracy, where accommodation, especially of religious minorities, has been minimal at best. More importantly, even if religious minorities are accommodated in one way or another in a Western democracy, the social legal structure that exists there offers a number of mechanisms that can work to ease the severity of the multicultural entrapment. In such countries, though to various or varying degrees, there exists a common institution of citizenship that is considered to be a legitimate contender over the well-being of citizens as such. Consequently, state institutions, the legislature, executive, and the judiciary can work more freely and care for the liberal interests of individuals, even if at the expense of the particular religious group. For these individuals are also full state citizens. Because of this same reality, one can also assume that religious minority members who seek to exit their community will be able to find a sphere to which they can exit to. If I was an Amish living in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, I could just move to Philadelphia and become just an ordinary citizen. It is possible, even though it's hard, but it is possible. But the constitutional environment in what is considered to be a nation state can be different, thereby challenging some of the basic assumptions and justifications for why religious minorities need to be accommodated. For one thing, many of these nation states are non-assimilative, right? They do not seek to create one unifying civic identity for all its citizens as a substitute for the religious one. On the contrary, the system as such seeks to preserve each of the existing identities in order to preserve itself. This in turn raises the question whether from the point of view of multiculturalism, the state should accommodate religious minorities with extensive jurisdictional authority or settle for some external protection. If there's no assimilation and the group identity is not threatened, then we might ask from the multicultural theory, why should we accommodate group if the whole system is about groups and membership? It's not like somebody is trying to assimilate me if I was a minority member living in the US or in Canada. The pull makes it necessary to preserve some group identity in order to defend the individual. But if the state itself is non-assimilative, on the contrary, it seeks to preserve the identity, then we might ask, why do we need the accommodation? The system as is a guarantee of preserving identities. Second, given the nature of the nation state, the multicultural entrapment of weak individuals within religious groups, especially women and children, becomes especially acute. If the religious minority is accommodated on top of the non-assimilative character of the state, then think of women members of these religious groups. The entrapment becomes especially acute. As already noted, in nation-state, there is no inclusive civic identity that all citizens identify with equally. Consequently, minority group members that wish to exit their religious group are not only burdened by the usual constraints of exit, but essentially have nowhere to exit to. Can a Bedouin woman from a tribe in the Naqab just immigrate and become a Tel Aviv resident? How possible is that? The absence of an all-inclusive civic identity also diminishes the capacity of the various branches of government, naturally identified with the nation-state ideals and aspirations, to intervene on behalf of members of religious minorities against their religious community jurisdiction. Such intervention will be regarded as that of outsiders, thereby denying state institutions the leverage of legitimacy and public cause they ordinarily enjoy in Western democracies when intervening in minority affairs. There is a Bedouin Knesset member today who is in a polygamous marriage relationship. He's a legislator, and polygamy is a crime. But does that bother anyone? In concluding, I would like to make two observations. The first is analytical, looking at religious millets through the prism of multiculturalism makes it possible for us to better assess the justifications for accommodating religious groups in our modern times. It also implies that even if we are able to find a powerful justification for why religious groups need to be accommodated, that this might solve one problem but be an invitation for a whole set of new other problems. Therefore, if we are truly committed to liberal multiculturalism, we cannot tend to the justifications and leave aside their ricochets. My second remark is sentimental and ideological. Dealing with identity politics, whether in the realm of religious groups or other groups that are defined by ethnicity, nationality, language, culture, tend to imply that we as individuals are all about identity. We are embedded in this culture and apparently cannot think without it. But going back to where we started from in this lecture, we also share a lot in common. We have a humanity that we can also cherish and celebrate. We have an affection that is more than often transnational and transreligious. We have needs and quests that we share with so many and irrespective of who they are. Maybe it is time for our humanity to shine as well. This does not need to dominate the scene, yet it can certainly be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Karayanni, for your wide-ranging and deeply analytical question. And as you told me before, you are willing to take some questions. So whoever wants to put the first question is most welcome.
Was it so convincing? Was it so convincing?
Apparently. أفهمتهم بالمحاضرة. Any questions? Go ahead, Professor Malik, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much.
Can you raise your voice a bit?
Yes, well, thank you very much for this rather enlightening lecture. There are a couple of questions, but let me just try to formulate at least one modest kind of intervention. Dealing with South Asia and with Europe, certainly there are lots of minorities, especially religious minorities. There are lots of them. So dealing with these minorities from the perspective of the state itself is, of course, as you said, in the majority and is interested in kind of perpetuating different minority identities. So there's a identity politics behind that. So first of all, I'm not sure whether these sorts of identity politics do really serve the purpose, whether it is multiculturalism or assimilation or policy of integration. basically the idea should be, shouldn't it, to get rid of the idea or the notion of minority. I mean, minority and majority, of course, is a very complex cultural ensemble, and they perceive each other and make each other. Yet, I think, and given, of course, the rise of religion and the return of the gods, or and the ambivalence of religion, I do not see in the current scenario that religious minorities could basically be integrated in a meaningful way. So my plea would be, is there any possibility to get rid of the idea of minority? Now in the Indian context, you have a huge minority, 200 million Muslims. Yet these Muslims say that they would like to stick to the minority rights. Now this problem, of course, entails that these minorities will never become part of the mainstream. They will always be, remembered and always be minorities. So I'm a bit uncomfortable with that. Although, dealing with this notion of minority, it's a very powerful thing, and as you said, maybe it's a very natural thing also. But does it really serve the purpose?
I would start my answer with the purpose of what? What I was trying to say is that there is this very powerful argument saying that we as individuals are embedded in some kind of a culture, and this can be a religion as well. I mean, I can think of myself as being an ultra-Orthodox Jew living in Mea Sha'ari. I think my individual autonomy, my way of living, my way of perceiving reality and perceiving the world is my community, which defines it. And if you are true with liberalism as something that is intended to defend your autonomy, then there is a very powerful claim. Well, you need to preserve that community, otherwise this individual would lose something of himself or herself. We tend to think of liberalism as also very secular, as suiting what we would deem as comfortable for us. But there is a lot of thought that liberalism is itself a dictatorship, in a sense, for many others. I mean, you want to impose these liberal notions of what is just, what is true, what is good, what is right, what is wrong, on other people, and you want to be indifferent. You want to have them brought in. But then we should also think of liberalism, or what exists in society at large, as something which is biased in a sense. It is suitable for a certain kind of a population. Now, I always tell my students that liberalism is in a sense a dictatorship, but it's an apple pie dictatorship. It's more convenient than many other, because this is how we think that we should handle, and we would care for the other and the different. But the question is, think of these groups that cherish their nomos, their characteristics, and you cannot be indifferent to the individual autonomy if you accept the proposition that my individual autonomy is embedded in a certain group, culture. Now, there are some people who would even argue against this argument. Jeremy Waldron is a very notable philosopher. He said, well, this is not something true that we are embedded in one culture. He said that we are embedded in many cultures at the same time. I can be an Arab, I can be a Jew, But let's count the hours in the day that I'm an Arab or a Jew when I come to the university and teach and be engaged with my students and have friends of all sorts. I'm not one thing all the time. I'm a number of things at the same time. And so this argument that was proposed that you are embedded in certain culture is not that persuasive from Walter's point of view. And therefore he kinds of questions this proposition. But this is a factual issue. And putting that aside, if we want to accept at the face value that you are embedded in a certain culture, you cannot be indifferent to your culture. That's one thing. The other thing I tried to allude to is that some states are not supposedly neutral by democracy or liberalism. Some states take a certain identity. And this makes the proposition, let's have something which is all-inclusive, when I, as a state, is an exclusive agenda, it kind of makes it very hard to come and offer something which is inclusive, such as citizenship, to the minorities who don't belong, as the case happens to be in many Asian and Middle Eastern countries, where the state is identified with something. You can take Israel, you can take Egypt, you can take Jordan. The state does have a certain character, in some cases religious, in other places just purely national. But it does have something that would exclude others that are within. And then the question is, what do you do in such a case? So there needs to be also a distinction, even if we accept the proposition, between states that do take a certain character and those that do not. We think of the United States, and this is something that I'm researching at the moment, as a state where religion is supposedly separated. And the state does not take a certain, at least public or official character as being this or that. But I was just researching the anti-discrimination laws of the United States. And the norm is very clear. You cannot discriminate on the basis of ethnicity, race, color, whatever. But there's an exemption. And the exemption is for religious institutions, the religious exemption. So for instance, we can take the clear case. If I want to apply for a job in a synagogue, and I happen to be Catholic, can the synagogue say, well, I cannot accept you in because of your religion? Is that possible? The norm says you cannot discriminate on the basis of religion, but then there's an exception which makes it possible for a synagogue, for a mosque, or for a church to say, well, I don't accept you to my community as a priest because of your religion. But what if I was a janitor and I wanted to work as a janitor in this religious institution? Can it still discriminate against me? What if I came in as a mathematics teacher to teach in a school that belongs to the Catholic Church or to the Jewish community? Can that school say, well, I don't want you in because you're not Jewish or you're not Catholic? President says, yes, the school can discriminate against me. Some churches that have some schools were openly discriminated on the basis of color. They said blacks are not welcome in, neither as workers or as students. A very famous case, it's called the Bob Jones case in the US, right? This Bob Jones University was given a tax exception, whereby I can contribute to that university and my contribution would be deducted from my income, the taxable income. And Bob Jones had an internal policy whereby its students cannot date people of color, blacks. And can that stand? And can that university still enjoy, right, the tax exception privilege that was granted by the government? there's a whole big discussion. This is the US that is supposedly very friendly to a lot of immigrants, and compared with Europe, it is true. You can arrive at the US, and it's easy to assimilate. But this is the US, with all its advancement in terms of how we deal with religion. Still, it has this characteristic where when it comes to religion, there is this exemption. And this exemption is a cause for a lot of discussion and controversy. A teacher got pregnant out of wedlock, and she was employed by a Catholic school, and she was dismissed because this is considered to be against Catholic religious norms. And that was sustained. The Bob Jones case, the exemption, it was taken from the university. So you can see that what we are dealing with is something that happens to be universal, and this sentiment of being within a certain religion is giving rise to a lot of exemptions. Now, one thing I got out of all of this reading and this research is that dealing with all of this by strict formal liberalism is not leading to anywhere. This is not something that is convincing people on the other side. But when you bring in multiculturalism, when you bring in something, a theory that is accommodating on the one hand, but reserving something to be in common on the other, things become more manageable. And this is what I try to discuss in my talk.
Yes, please, Professor Rovinelli.
Well, thank you very much for bringing out the complexities and the multifaceted nature of those issues. Now, let me start by saying that I'm going to ask a question as somebody who sees himself as a soft communitarian. So I have a lot of sympathy for some of the aspects which you brought out. And I do believe that soft communitarianism also enhances individual autonomy. It may sound as a contradiction, but I think it's not. But there is a question of boundaries and borders. And let me take a hard case. And it may not be fair, but I think hard cases sometimes give you, make you have to think hard. Take the issue of female genital mutilation. And on the other hand, circumcision. Now, what are the borders where the state or society, it doesn't have to be the state, it can be society, it can be public opinion, recognizes something as a legitimate religious convention or tradition or practice and accepts it? And what are the borders where you say, no, this is beyond the pale? And there can be other examples as well. You can even say polygamy. If it's polygamy and polyandry, why not? If it is among consenting adults within a religious community that accepts it. So can you suggest some guidelines for the borderline?
The short answer is no.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's my short answer. But I've read a lot of pieces that dealt with similar dilemmas. Right? Female genital mutilation. I've heard this claim, and he was a noticeable children rights professor from London, and he said, well, if I would ask many of the Jews who become adults, looking back at the procedure of circumcision, would they accept it or would they decline the procedure once they become adults? And he thinks that 99.9% of Jews would tend to accept the procedure going and relating it back to when they were infants. Okay? But you can't say the same about female genital mutilation, and therefore this might be more tolerated and that might not be tolerated. I saw some crazy articles saying, well, if this is something which is not religious actually, it is customary within certain communities that female genital mutilations, well, I don't agree, okay? Let's have that procedure performed by certified surgeons in order to handle the repercussions, the medical repercussions. That's something I also found. But this is, I think, it's intolerable and cannot accept it. But the proposition, I think, that the Charles Prison Rights professor does offer some insight. You can accept it or you deny it, but you would find some dealing. Polygamy is a harder case. If it's on both sides, as you suggested, well, we can accept it. But then I always ask, and I challenge my students, why is it, and this is a claim that you hear from a lot of Bedouin men, well, why is it possible for these Western men to have a mistress, 1, 2, 3, and we will see that as okay. But if I marry a second wife or a third wife openly, and I take on myself the obligations, then this is considered to be an illegal act. Why is the first permissible and the second is not? And this kind of raises the issue of who's kind of determining the norms of society and what they stand for. But this is about polygamy, of course. It is problematic, but then think of how the reality of polygamy is in Israel and how the legal system is not really caring about it. As I said, there's a basic number. I have a student, and she's actually a Bedouin student, and she's writing a doctorate dissertation on polygamy. And the statistics are fascinating. 1 of each, or 4 to 5 Bedouin women is in a polygamous marriage. That's enormous. And when you kind of get into how things are handled, from the outside we say this is something that we cannot tolerate. But from the inside, women are saying, well, I can't go on living in a society where a woman has to be married and cannot just stay single. Look at the stigma on me as a woman who have become 30 years old and I'm not married. And you kind of find all of these internal dilemmas, which you cannot just push aside or disregard. You kind of see some of the internal logic, even from the outside. You tend to see it as an intolerable conduct practice. But these are certainly some of the most central dilemmas in when we deal with multiculturalism and when we deal with identity politics. But this is part of who we are, this is part of society. And we have to think of mechanisms where we can deal and try to find something that will enable us to deal with these realities. A Muslim girl coming to school with veil. We have a very famous case in Israel. The Muslim student came from al-Fahim to study in a Catholic school in Nazareth. And the school said, well, you cannot be admitted, even though she passed the admissions exams, unless you take off the veil. Justice Barak, who wrote that decision, said that this is a private school, and it belongs to one of the recognized religious communities. And the school has an interest in commonality as a virtue of pluralism, right? That all students come in a unified uniform, and you cannot come in with the veil. Now, I don't think that that is just, or that is right. First of all,
A lot of the religious schools in Israel are publicly funded. They have received about 75% of their budget from the government. Okay? So it's not totally private, it's very public. The second issue is that, well, pluralism is not about commonality. Pluralism is respecting difference. And my third point, seeing how things can be complex. I mean, how do you think that the teachers and the principal of the school would come into St. Joseph, the Al-Mutram school? And if there were nuns there, how would you think that they will come into school? They would come in with their gown, their religious wardrobe. And this is actually the case in these schools. In Germany, when they dealt with the veil, and they wanted to restrict the veil in some of the states in Germany, they first targeted the staff, and they did not touch the students. When a Muslim teacher wanted to come in Bavaria and teach, they said, well, that's problematic. But when it comes to the students, they have the religious right to come in as they please. So, but in Israel, it was kind of the other way around. The court or the establishment targeted the students first and relieved the staff from the commonality requirement, where if we want to think truly about commonality, it should first come from the staff and then from the students. So things can be, and in Schmidt, I mean in Jerusalem, I don't know if you're aware of the news lately. Schmidt is a German kind of a school in East Jerusalem, run by nuns, and it accepts Muslim students, girls. It's a girls' school. And it's in the headlines just lately that the Muslim girl student wanted to come to the ceremony of graduation with a veil, whereby ordinary she did not come, and she was restricted from coming to the ceremony with the veil. And it's in court. It's been very much discussed. These are very serious dilemmas. There is no clear-cut answer, but dealing with these issues strictly by liberalism, I think, does not lead us to the kind of insights that this dealing with soft communitarianism and multiculturalism, whereas the difference can also be blurred in some of these aspects. I think that they have a better chance in leading us through with the complexities of such dilemmas.
Thank you very much. This was an extensive reply and a fascinating one. Any further questions? We have here some experts on Israeli law. Anybody would like to make life hard for Professor Karayanni? If not, thank you very much.
Thank you.